This cold case was solved by one tiny clue. It's 1997, a small town in the Midwest. A 24-year-old woman named Rachel Bennett leaves her apartment one evening to walk to a friend's house. She never makes it there. She never comes home. For 26 years, her case sat in a cardboard box in a police evidence room. Detectives came and went. Leads dried up. The file got thicker with dead ends, but thinner with hope. Her family kept calling, kept asking, kept waiting. And then, one day in 2023, a detective pulled out an old piece of evidence. Something so small, most people would have thrown it away without a second thought. A tiny piece of fabric. Not even an inch long. Faded, slightly torn. It had been collected from the last place Rachel was seen. But back in the 90s, the technology just wasn't there to do much with it. They logged it, put it in a bag, and filed it away. Nobody knew at the time that this one tiny piece of fabric would eventually solve the entire case. This isn't one of those stories where everything was obvious from the beginning. This is the kind of case that makes you realize how much can change in just a couple of decades, not because people suddenly cared more, but because science finally caught up. Today on Shadow Files, we're going deep into the disappearance of Rachel Bennett. We're going to walk through what happened that night in 1997. Why the case went cold for so long, and how one single, almost insignificant piece of evidence finally gave her family the answers they had been waiting for over a quarter of a century. If you've ever wondered how cold cases actually get solved in real life, not the Hollywood version, but the slow, patient, sometimes frustrating reality, then stick around. Because this one is a perfect example of how sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference. Let's get into it. Disclaimer. Before we go any further, I want to be very clear. This channel tells real stories with respect. We focus on the facts, the investigation, and the impact these cases have on real people. We will never sensationalize violence or treat victims as entertainment. If at any point this story becomes too heavy, please take care of yourself. Now, let's start at the beginning. Rachel Bennett was 24 years old in the summer of 1997. She lived in a quiet town called Millbrook. Population just under 12,000 people. It was the kind of place where most people knew each other, at least by face. Rachel worked as a receptionist at a local dental office. She was quiet but friendly. The type of person who remembered people's names and asked how their kids were doing. She had moved to Millbrook about 3 years earlier from a bigger city, looking for a slower pace. Her family still lived about 2 hours away, and she made the drive to see them almost every other weekend. She had a small circle of close friends in town and was known for being responsible and independent. On the evening of August 14, 1997, Rachel finished her shift at the dental office around 5:30 in the afternoon. She stopped by the grocery store on her way home, bought a few things for dinner, and was seen by the cashier at around 6:10 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of her for a very long time. She had plans to meet a friend, Lisa, at Lisa's house later that evening. They were going to watch a movie and catch up. Rachel told Lisa she would be there around 7:30 or 8 o'clock. When 8:30 rolled around and Rachel still hadn't shown up, Lisa tried calling her apartment. No answer. She tried again 30 minutes later. Still nothing. By 10 p.m., Lisa was worried enough to drive over to Rachel's apartment. Her car was parked in its usual spot. The lights were off. No one answered the door. Lisa used the spare key Rachel had given her and went inside. Everything looked normal. Rachel's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her keys were there too. The only thing missing was Rachel herself. Lisa immediately called Rachel's parents. Then she called the police. When officers arrived, they did a quick search of the apartment. There were no signs of struggle. No forced entry. Nothing obviously out of place. Rachel's bed was still made from that morning. The groceries she bought earlier were still sitting on the kitchen counter, untouched. At first, many people assumed she had gone somewhere voluntarily. Maybe she decided to visit her parents without telling anyone. Maybe she met someone new. In a small town in 1997, missing person cases involving young adults were sometimes treated as low priority if there were no obvious signs of foul play. But Rachel's parents knew something was wrong. Their daughter was reliable. She always called. She would never just disappear without telling anyone, especially not her mom. By the next morning, a more serious search began. Officers walked the route Rachel would have taken from her apartment to Lisa's house. They checked with neighbors. They put out a description to surrounding towns. Nothing. No one had seen her after she left the grocery store. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her phone, which back then was a landline, never rang again from her apartment. The days turned into weeks. Flyers went up around town. Local news ran a short segment. Volunteers searched the woods and fields on the edge of town. But as time passed and no new leads came in, the intensity of the search naturally started to fade. Other cases came in. Other priorities took over. By the end of 1997, Rachel Bennett's case had gone cold. For the next several years, it stayed that way. Her parents kept pushing. They called the police department regularly. They hired a private investigator for a short time with money they didn't really have. But without new evidence or witnesses coming forward, there was very little anyone could do. Rachel's mom, Diane, later said in an interview that the hardest part wasn't even the not knowing at first. It was the slow realization that the world was moving on without her daughter. Birthdays came and went. Holidays happened. People stopped asking. But for Diane and her husband, every single day still started and ended with the same question: where is Rachel? In 2003, 6 years after she disappeared, the police department did another round of interviews and rechecked some old leads. Nothing new surfaced. The case was officially classified as a cold case and moved into long-term storage. That's where it stayed for almost 2 decades. Every few years, a new detective would get assigned to review the old files. They would read through the reports, look at the photos, maybe make a few phone calls. But without anything fresh to go on, the file would go back on the shelf. Meanwhile, DNA technology was quietly improving in laboratories across the country. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA testing was still relatively new and expensive. Many smaller police departments didn't have the budget or the training to use it on every case. And even when they did collect potential DNA evidence, the technology at the time often required larger, cleaner samples than what was available in older cases. Rachel's case had very little physical evidence to begin with, because there were no obvious signs of a struggle at her apartment. Investigators hadn't collected much. The main items they had taken were things she might have touched in the hours before she disappeared: a glass from her kitchen, the grocery bag she brought home, and a few items from her purse. One of those items was a small piece of fabric. It had been found near the sidewalk on the route Rachel would have walked. It was just a torn corner of what looked like it might have come from a jacket or a shirt. It was dirty, faded, and at the time, it didn't seem particularly important. There was no blood on it, no obvious damage that suggested violence. It was simply logged as possible trace evidence and put into storage with everything else. For years, that tiny piece of fabric sat in an evidence bag inside a box, in a room full of other boxes. No one had any reason to believe it was connected to Rachel's disappearance in any meaningful way. It could have been trash. It could have been from anyone who walked down that sidewalk on any given day. But in 2022, something changed. A new detective was assigned to review some of the older cold cases in the department. Detective Mark Ellison had a particular interest in cases that might benefit from modern forensic technology. He started going through the old boxes one by one. When he opened Rachel Bennett's file, he read through everything: the original reports, the witness statements, the timeline. Then he looked at the list of physical evidence that had been collected. Most of it was routine. But one item stood out to him: that small piece of fabric. He pulled the evidence bag out of the box and looked at it under better lighting than what had been available in 1997. Something about it didn't sit right with him. The fabric looked like it might have come from clothing. But the tear pattern seemed unusual. It wasn't a clean rip. It looked like it had been pulled or caught on something. More importantly, Detective Ellison knew that DNA technology had advanced dramatically since the case was first investigated. Even tiny amounts of skin cells or other biological material that would have been impossible to test in the 90s could now be analyzed. He sent the fabric to the state crime lab with a request for advanced DNA testing. He didn't have high expectations. After all, the item had been sitting in storage for over 2 decades. But he figured it was worth trying. Months passed. Then, in early 2023, the lab called him back. They had found something. On that tiny piece of fabric, they had recovered a partial DNA profile. It wasn't a full profile, but it was enough to run through the system. And when they ran it, it matched someone who had been in the system for an unrelated charge from several years earlier. A man named Daniel Crow. Crow had lived in Millbrook back in the late 1990s. He had a criminal record that included some minor offenses, but nothing that had ever connected him to Rachel Bennett at the time. After the disappearance, he had moved out of state and mostly stayed off the radar until a DUI arrest in 2018 put his DNA into the system. When Detective Ellison saw the match, he knew this was the break they had been waiting for. But he also knew they needed more. A partial DNA match from an old piece of fabric wasn't enough on its own to make an arrest. Especially in a case this old. They needed to build a stronger connection. Over the next several months, investigators quietly dug into Crow's life in 1997. They tracked down old coworkers, neighbors, and anyone who might have known him back then. They looked at phone records, work schedules, and anything else they could find. What they discovered was troubling. On the night Rachel disappeared, Crow had been working a shift at a warehouse on the edge of town. His shift ended at 6:45 p.m., right around the time Rachel would have been walking home from the grocery store. The warehouse was less than a 10-minute drive from the route she took. More importantly, one of Crow's old coworkers remembered something. He said that around that time, Crow had shown up to work one day with a tear in his jacket. When the coworker asked what happened, Crow had brushed it off and said he caught it on something at home. That detail, combined with the DNA on the fabric, suddenly made the tiny piece of evidence much more significant. Investigators obtained a warrant and searched Crow's current residence. Among the items they collected was an old jacket, the same style that had been popular in the late 90s. On the sleeve of that jacket, there was a small tear in almost the exact same location and pattern as the piece of fabric found near Rachel's route in 1997. When they tested the jacket, they found traces of Rachel's DNA on the inside lining near the tear. It was the connection they needed. In the summer of 2023, Daniel Crow was arrested and charged in connection with Rachel Bennett's disappearance. During the investigation and eventual court proceedings, it became clear that the tiny piece of fabric had been the key that unlocked everything. Without that one small item, something that could have easily been overlooked or thrown away, the case might have stayed cold forever. Rachel's family finally had answers after 26 years. It didn't bring her back. It didn't undo the pain they had carried for more than 2 decades. But it gave them something they had been denied for so long: the truth. In court, Crow eventually accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to a significant amount of time in prison. For Detective Ellison and the team who worked the case in its final years, it was a reminder of why they do this work. Cold cases aren't just old files. They're real people, real families, and sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to look at an old piece of evidence with fresh eyes, and the technology finally being good enough to see what was always there. Rachel Bennett's story is one of many. Across the country, there are still thousands of cold cases sitting in evidence rooms, waiting for that one tiny clue to finally be understood. Some of them will be solved. Some of them won't, but as long as there are families still asking questions, and detectives still willing to open those old boxes, there's always a chance. Thank you for watching this episode of Shadow Files. If this story moved you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps more than you know. And if you have any thoughts or theories about this case, feel free to share them in the comments. Just keep it respectful. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.